Good evening, I'm Thuy Vu. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. It's been an eventful week with the governor's address from the state capitol, emotions running high in Oakland, not to mention a new one-of-a-kind arts institution celebrating a grand opening in San Francisco. We have much to get to, so let's begin by introducing our panelists. Joining me tonight are Mathai Kuruvilla, San Francisco Chronicle reporter, and Jolie Odell of VentureBeat.com, as well as John Myers, KXTV political editor, joining us from Sacramento. Governor Jerry Brown struck a confident tone on Thursday, applauding lawmakers and voters for making tough decisions to balance California's budget. He also pushed for his priorities, including education and regulatory reform. Now, John, how would you rate his speech, and what left the biggest impressions on you?
Well, you know, rating the speech, a speech from Jerry Brown is really tough to do because it's unlike any other speech you get from any other governor. I mean, how many governors go from the book of Genesis to the little engine that could in one 25-minute speech? I mean, this was a vintage Jerry Brown speech, and I think, you know, really what you saw here was a little bit of the governor running a victory lap. Proposition 30 passed, the temporary taxes passed, the budget looks a lot better. But I also think this was the governor's chance to pivot to talking about what makes California great, how we get them back on track, and, you know, don't worry, we're getting there. And so I took this as a real optimistic speech with a lot of details, a lot of Brown history facts, and really a message, I think, not only to the legislature, but to the public of, like, I'm watching it, we're going to be careful, but we're going to move forward.
And John, you mentioned that he was very quirky in his speech, and clearly the governor's enjoying his popularity right now, and he quoted everyone from philosophers and poets, and he was lyrical at times. Let's take a listen.
Is that enough?
I'm sorry, say again, Thuy?
What is but the most diverse, creative, and longest-standing mass migration in the history of the world? That's California, and we are our sons and daughters. This special destiny never ends. It slows, it falters, it goes off the track in ignorance and prejudice, but soon resumes again, more vibrant and more stunning in its boldness.
So, John, how has this speech been received by lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans?
Well, I think he got pretty high marks. You know, the interesting thing about State of the State speeches is it really depends, is the governor talking to the members of the legislature in the room? Is he talking to the public, the rest of California, through those of us in the press? I think the legislators gave him pretty good marks, even Republicans, many of them who said he sounded like a conservative. And I think, you know, the great fascinating thing of 2013 here in Sacramento, the state capitol, is Jerry Brown with a Democratic supermajority in the legislature. Do they get behind him and let him lead? Do they want to make their own decisions here? Is there any kind of conflict? The leadership of the legislature, the Assembly Speaker John Perez, the Senate Pro Tem Darrell Steinberg, both said, no, we're on board with Jerry Brown's plan. But, you know, there are Democrats in the legislature who have a much broader view of state spending and restoration of previous cuts. And the governor's going to have an interesting debate with those Democrats about what the state really can afford.
John, how fleeting is this financial stability? Because he's choosing these capital projects when you have health and welfare programs that have been cut by $15 billion over the last 4 years, but he's clearly choosing not to go in that direction.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the challenge here is knowing exactly what the state's finances are. We got this data over the last week or so that showed about a $4 billion increase in revenues from what we thought we had. It turns out, you know, that we really don't know for sure where the economy is going. We don't know if that was a temporary thing. We don't know if it was money that came in early because of the federal tax concerns and the people who are the most wealthy in California paying early. The bottom line is we don't really know what those revenues are. I think the governor wants to wait and see what they are before he starts talking about those restorations. But, you know, one of the really fascinating things in this speech is that the governor made a point of saying, you know, just giving money back to people only to take it away when the economy goes bad is cruel. It's not progressive. It is bad politics. It's bad for the people. It's bad governing. I'm not going to go back and do that. And I think you are going to hear the governor make this time and again that we want these programs, but if it's not long-term sustainable money, we shouldn't be spending it.
Well, since you're talking about long-term projects, John, he still wants the water tunnels. He still wants high-speed rail. How realistic are those goals, given that there's so much uncertainty in the future?
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating. I mean, one of the things we got out of this speech is the split personality of Jerry Brown in a way. He's a guy who says, I'm tight-fisted, I'm going to, watch every nickel, we're not going to spend too much money. And then he says, but we're going to spend billions on high-speed rail and a water project through the Delta. I think that the water project is the first big hurdle here in Sacramento. He's got to convince people about those underground tunnels that would go around the Delta, that there's enough habitat restoration. That's a big fight with environmentalists. And on high-speed rail, I mean, it's going to break ground projected at the end of 2013, but the money that California needs is from Washington. It's not from California pocketbooks. And the congressional Republicans at this point have said no way, no how. The governor has got to continue to use the bully pulpit, I think, to try to make that case, even though the president is on his side, to get that money. So, we're talking about long-term versus less long-term, short-term money here. I think that's the way the governor would explain it, but I do think that selling this to the public is tough, to say we don't have money to do more than what we're doing, but we've got this grand vision that we have to spend money for. He's got to find a way to explain that, I think, to Californians.
And John, real quickly, what about education? Still a top priority for him. What does he plan to do with that?
I think education, Tweety, is the big fight of 2013. I really would tell people to pay attention to this one. The governor's plan, in brief, would loosen the rules that Sacramento makes on local schools and how they spend their money. It would also send more money to schools with poor children and English learners. That means that you're going to have money shifted away from some suburban schools, from some rural schools. That's a huge fight. And I think, what we think that's going to be versus the political fight we're going to have, it's really going to be one to watch.
All right, and we will be watching, and so will you. John, thanks so much for joining us. We have to say goodbye to you now. I know that you want to spend time with your family and your young kids. Have a good evening.
Thanks, Tweet.
All right, thank you. Well, to Oakland now. After hours of heated testimony, the City Council voted to hire an outsider, police consultant Bill Bratton. He's the former police chief in Los Angeles and New York, praised by many, but also vilified by others. Now, Mathai, with Oakland's high crime rate, why are people so up in arms about Bill Bratton, and why is he so controversial?
Well, he really is symbolic of a lot of tensions within Oakland right now. You have a city with a high crime rate already, and it's been rising. It was a 23% increase last year. At the same time, you have so there's a faction of the community that is very concerned about increasing the amount of police that there is in the city. At the same time, there's a faction, and it's not clear how large these groups are, but that is very resentful of the way policing is done in Oakland. And so Bratton comes to symbolize that, because he not only was the police chief at a time when crime went down in New York, but he also used very aggressive tactics. And the specter of both of those things happening riled up two of these very polarized forces within the city.
He also has implemented in the past something called stop and frisk. And what is that? And why are there so many critics?
Well, stop and frisk goes back many, many decades, and the Supreme Court affirmed it as a use in 1968. So it's been around and in practice for a long time. And basically what it allows is if an officer has a reasonable suspicion that somebody has been involved in a crime, they're allowed to stop them. And if they have reasonable suspicion that the person is armed, they can pat them down externally. They can't put their hands into a suspect's pockets, for example. But what Bratton did, and so that's a practice, those are allowed, and civil rights attorneys will say that's allowed all over the country. What Bratton did in New York was a much more aggressive form of that. There was in heavy crime areas, open-air drug market areas, you had a very intensive use of stop and frisk. And now, those drug market areas in New York were heavily impacted. Now, whether they could have been impacted without stop and frisk is an open question, sociologists say. So, but Bratton and other police advocates would say it was instrumental. But again, that's an open question whether how necessary that was.
Now, how much interaction will Bratton have with the community? Because at the City Council meeting this week, there was heated public testimony for hours with people opposed to having him in the city of Oakland and bringing his policies here. How effective can he be if the community doesn't support him?
It's an interesting question. Originally, he was going to be leading these town hall forums where he would be interacting with the community, and recognizing the reaction that he got in Oakland, the police chief quickly realized that that was not going to be a good position for him. At the same time, what he's going to be doing is he's going to be implementing a crime plan for a city. Now, this is a city with the highest violent crime rate in the entire state, and it doesn't have a crime plan on how to address it. And so he's going to be working on that and developing more data-driven policing policies. And these are things that really deal more with the management of the police department and, improving the efficiency of management. And theoretically, that's something he could have a huge impact on and not be roiled up in this community reaction as much.
Well, it is a critical time for Oakland. As you say, it's now described as the most dangerous city in California. 131 homicides last year, the most since 2006. There are only 613 officers now. That's the lowest staffing level in Oakland in more than a decade. So what exactly is in Bratton's contract? What is he responsible for?
Some of that is vague, and that's brought up some concerns. But again, there's a program called CompStat, which helps management or command staff in the police department figure out how to deploy officers and the department as a whole in relation to the crime and the way that it's happening. So that's something that he's proven that he's very good at in New York. Hotspot policing is another way people talk about it, and that was a key element of his strategy in New York. So that is one element, and again, increasing the efficiency of how the department responds to crime. Now, what exactly specifically he'll be doing, that's a little bit more vague.
Is there an irony here? Because Oakland used to have a police chief, Anthony Batts, as you know, and he had views that were very similar to Bratton, and the city ran him out of town. So amid that backdrop, can we read anything into that about Bratton's chances of succeeding in Oakland?
Well, he's really just a tiny portion of what policing will be about in Oakland, and I think that's, again, why I think about him as more a symbol than what the day-to-day might be, because his contract is really for a whole team of people, and it's a $250,000 contract. Oakland spends $160 million on policing every year, and so this is just a very tiny portion of the police budget, and so we'll see what kind of impact he'll have. But there's so much focus on him; it's almost taking away from the larger issues that are happening right now.
That's a good point. Okay, I know you'll be watching. All right, let's move on to Silicon Valley now. The maker of iPads and iPhones posted strong profits, $13 billion in the final quarter of 2012 for Apple. But the news landed with a thud as the company's stock prices plummeted. So, Jolie, why the drop?
Oh, it's a little bit of a mystery to everybody who's looking very realistically at the numbers, I think. Analysts predicted that Apple in the last quarter would sell something like 50 million iPhones, and Apple disappointed them by selling 47.8 million iPhones. They beat expectations for a lot of other estimates, but they fell behind in a couple. Analysts thought Apple would sell a lot more Macs. Surprise, surprise, consumers today are buying more phones than computers, and Apple missed the mark there. But still, they have very strong revenue, record profits. Investors, I think, were disappointed for the wrong reasons, and that's why the stock has dropped. But it's dropped a lot, 15 or 16% in the past 5 days alone. In
fact, it's dropped enough to make Apple no longer the world's most valuable company. Exxon kind of came back on top today.
They've been back and forth with those kinds of positions for at least a couple years now.
Now, what are some of the major reasons, do you think, for the slump in demand for Apple products? CEO Tim Cook has indicated that he won't reconsider the iPhone's smaller 3.5 and 4-inch screens, even at a time when other smartphones are offering bigger screens and doing quite well.
Well, I think Apple, they see the positive. They see a very glass half full when it comes to these smaller phones that fit smaller hands a little bit better. But I don't know that that's written in stone, anything that they say. You know, we've heard for the longest time that Apple was not going to be doing a 7-inch tablet, and yet the iPad mini launched very well earlier in 2012. So I don't know what we're going to see from Apple. Nobody knows what we're going to see from Apple in terms of new products. But I think what we're seeing is they're kind of softening a little bit. They're opening up to new ideas. They're rolling out new kinds of products, and we can't really say what they will or won't launch in the next 2 or 3 years. I think it depends a lot on consumer demand.
Now, some analysts are saying that the era of innovation at Apple is over now that Steve Jobs is gone. What do you think?
Well, I think the era of Steve Jobs is over, and may he rest in peace. He was a design-focused dictator, and I think that when he came out with the iPhone in 2007, there was nothing like it, and but then his reign, if you will, became about conformity to that standard and control of the marketplace around it. And I think there's more opportunity now for Apple to be innovative than ever before in its history. I think the iPad mini is proof of that they can break boundaries and they can go beyond what they know how to do. The question is, will they? They still have a lot of really great designers and really great product people there, so we'll have to wait and see.
I want to talk just real quickly about another high-tech giant that was in the news this week, and Google recently beat an antitrust rap regarding Yelp. What was that all about, and does it still face other antitrust suits?
Google has been through the ringer when it comes to dealing with the feds, both in America and abroad. And antitrust is a big part of that whole enchilada. They're extremely competitive. They will do just about whatever it takes to make a profit. And with something like Yelp, what they were doing was pulling in reviews, pulling in Yelp content into Google products. It's kind of a search engine's business to bring in content from around the web and other services. But they were doing it in a way that Yelp thought was rather unfair, and the FTC was looking into that for about 1.5 years, 2 years. So it was a very long brewing case, and I'm sure Google will face many more like it in its history.
So, given that this week's big news involved Apple and Google, and taken together, what implications can we draw about the state of Silicon Valley?
Well, that's huge. That's a huge question. You've got these two huge companies doing really, really different things. You know, one is in hardware, one is almost entirely in software. And I think what we can learn, what we can say absolutely, is that the future of Silicon Valley no longer rests on your computer. It rests in your hand, in the palm of your hand. The fact that Apple disappointed analysts by not selling as many Macs as they thought they should have, that's a big sign. The fact that Intel decided it was going to start shutting down its PC-based motherboard business, that was a big sign. And Google's never been in the desktop business. So yeah, I think smartphones and tablets are very much the future.
Okay, since we're talking mobile and smartphones, just out of curiosity, do you have an iPhone?
I do not.
You
I
do
never
not.
have. I never. I'm actually quite bullish on Apple and its ability and potential to innovate and do more and better in smartphones, but I've never been an iPhone fan myself.
And why is that?
You know, it's the Henry Ford problem. When they first came out with the iPhones, it's like, here's your iPhone. You can have the same one as everybody else. And I'm an individual. I like to have choice.
All right. So you like some innovation and originality yourself.
And a 5-inch screen. Come on, I like them big.
That always helps.
Yes.
All right. Thank you.